The morning they put my suitcase on the front porch, I was 31 days away from my board certification exam. I need you to hold that detail, because it matters more than anything else I'm going to tell you. My suitcase. On the porch. In the rain. In Naperville, Illinois. At 7:23 in the morning on a Tuesday in October 2017. And 31 days later, I was going to sit for the most important examination of my entire medical career. The exam that would determine whether 6 years of surgical residency meant anything at all. My mother-in-law, Constance Beaumont, stood in the doorway of the house I had lived in for 2 years. She was wearing a cream silk robe. Her hair was set. It was 7:23 in the morning, and her hair was already set, which tells you something about Constance that words alone cannot fully communicate. She looked at me standing on her porch in the October rain next to my suitcase, and she said, in the particular voice she reserved for statements she had rehearsed, "Maya, this family deserves better than what you are. And what you are is someone who is never going to amount to anything." She closed the door. And I stood there in the rain for approximately 45 seconds, which is a very long time to stand in the rain next to your suitcase on your mother-in-law's porch thinking about what just happened to your life. And then I picked up the suitcase. And I walked to my car. And I drove to the hospital. Because I had a 9 a.m. surgery. And someone needed me in that operating room. And Constance Beaumont's opinion of me was not going to change that fact. But here is the question I want you to sit with as I tell you this story. Here is the thing that drove everything that came next, that shaped every decision I made in the 3 years between that October morning and the moment Constance Beaumont's husband was wheeled into my operating room on a gurney. What does a person do when the people who are supposed to be family look at everything you've built and decide it isn't enough? What do you do with that? Where does it go? I want to tell you what I did with it. But first I need to take you back. Not to the beginning. The real beginning is too far back and we'd be here all day. I need to take you to the specific moment when I understood, for the first time, what kind of family I had married into. It was Thanksgiving 2015. My first Thanksgiving as Maya Beaumont. I had been married to James Beaumont for 4 months. We had met in medical school. He was a second-year internal medicine resident. I was finishing my first year of cardiothoracic surgery residency at Northwestern Memorial. We had met at a department seminar on ventricular assist devices in February 2014, which is possibly the least romantic origin story in the history of romance. But there it is. He'd asked me a question about the research afterward. I'd answered it. He'd said, "That's the clearest explanation of that mechanism I've ever heard." I'd said, "Thank you." And we talked for 2 hours standing in a hospital corridor until a nurse very politely told us the seminar room needed to be locked up. We got married in June 2015.
Small ceremony.
41 guests. My parents flew in from Hyderabad. His family drove from Lake Forest, which is 28 miles from Chicago, and is, for reasons I will leave you to research independently, a very specific kind of place to be from. The Beaumonts of Lake Forest were not cruel people. I want to be precise about this because the story I'm telling is not about villains. Gerald Beaumont, James's father, was a retired corporate attorney who had spent 30 years at a firm in the Loop and who had the particular bearing of someone for whom success had arrived early enough to feel inevitable. His mother, Constance, had grown up in Winnetka, had gone to Northwestern for undergraduate, had married Gerald at 23 and raised 3 children. James, his older sister Catherine, and his younger brother William, in a house that had been in the Beaumont family since 1987 and which cost, at last assessment, approximately $2.3 million. They were not cruel. They were a family with a very specific picture of what a Beaumont daughter-in-law looked like. And I was not that picture. I am going to describe myself to you the way I imagine they saw me that first Thanksgiving, because I think it's important to understand both sides of what was happening. I was 29 years old. I was the daughter of Dr. Krishnamurti Sharma and Mrs. Lakshmi Sharma of Hyderabad, India, my father a cardiologist, my mother a secondary school mathematics teacher. I had come to the United States on a student visa in 2008, completed my undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan in 3.5 years instead of 4, because I had taken advanced placement coursework in India that transferred, gone directly to Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine, and was, by Thanksgiving 2015, 18 months into a 6-year cardiothoracic surgery residency at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I was, by any objective measure, someone who was doing something extraordinarily demanding and doing it well. I had a 3.94 GPA from medical school. I had published 2 papers before finishing my MD. My residency director, Dr. Franklin Osei, had told me in my first-year evaluation that I had the surgical instinct of someone 10 years your senior, which is not something Dr. Osei said to people he did not mean it about, because Dr. Osei did not say things he did not mean. But none of that was what the Beaumonts saw at Thanksgiving 2015. What they saw was a 29-year-old Indian woman who had married their son after knowing him for 14 months, who worked hours that made her largely unavailable for family dinners, who had student loan debt of $187,000, who did not own property, who drove a 2009 Honda Civic with 94,000 miles on it, and who could not, when Constance asked her about her plans for the next 5 years, give an answer that involved anything other than more training, more hospital hours, and more years before. Anything that looked like financial stability. Constance had asked that question, the 5-year plan question, at the Thanksgiving table in 2015, in front of Gerald, Catherine, William, Catherine's husband Brett, and William's girlfriend at the time whose name was Courtney. She had asked it the way people ask questions they already know the answer to, and want confirmed for the benefit of witnesses. I had said, I'll finish my residency in 2018. Then a 2-year fellowship, most likely in minimally invasive cardiac surgery. After that, attending position, probably here in Chicago if James's career keeps him here. Constance had said, so you'll be, how old? I said, 35 when I finish the fellowship. She said, and you'll have been in school, essentially, for, I said, 27 years if you count from kindergarten, 13 if you count from college. She had smiled. The specific smile of someone who has received exactly the information they needed. She said, that's a long time to be starting out. Catherine said, helpfully, Brett was a partner at his firm at 32. I said, that's wonderful. What field? Catherine said, real estate law. I said, and I ate my turkey. James squeezed my hand under the table. He knew. He always knew when it was happening. But James had a particular way of knowing things were happening and not quite knowing what to do about them, which is its own kind of complicated, and which I will come back to later because it matters enormously for understanding how we got to October 2017. The next 18 months were a slow accumulation of the same Thanksgiving dinner, told in different rooms and on different occasions. The Christmas, where Constance gave Catherine a piece of jewelry from Tiffany and gave me a Williams-Sonoma gift card for $75. The Easter, where Gerald asked James, in front of me, whether James had thought about the long-term picture given that Maya's path was going to be very demanding for a very long time. The summer dinner at their club in Lake Forest, where Constance introduced me to another couple as James's wife. She's in school still. I was a second-year surgical resident. I was operating 3 days a week. I had just assisted on a complex mitral valve repair that had been written up in a department case review because of a particular technical challenge I had identified and solved in real time. I was in school still. I did not correct her. I smiled. I shook the couple's hands. I ate the club salad, and I thought about the case review write-up, and I decided, in that particular way I had developed over 2 years of Beaumont family dinners, to simply keep building. Because here's the thing I understood by then that Constance and Gerald did not. I was not trying to earn their respect. I had stopped trying to earn their respect sometime in early 2016, when I had realized that their respect was not something that could be earned through achievement. It was something that was distributed through familiarity, through the specific cultural and social markers they recognized, and I did not, and would never have those markers in the form they expected. Therefore, waiting for their respect was waiting for something that was not going to come in the form I'd been imagining. So, I stopped waiting. And because I stopped waiting, I stopped performing for them. And because I stopped performing for them, I became, I think, genuinely less comprehensible to them. Because a daughter-in-law who doesn't seem to care what you think of her is, to people who have always believed that approval is a currency they control, a very confusing thing.
James.
I need to talk about James, because this story is not complete without honesty about James. James Beaumont was a good man. I want to say that clearly, and mean it. He was intelligent, careful, genuinely kind in the ways that matter, and he loved me in a real and specific way that was not contingent on my performing the things his family wanted me to perform. He was also a man who had been raised inside a particular system of family dynamics that he had never fully examined, and the failure to examine it had consequences that neither of us fully understood until it was too late. The specific consequence was this. When his family put pressure on him, the quiet, sustained, Beaumont-specific pressure of raised eyebrows and loaded questions, and just thinking about your future conversations, James bent. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, over months, in the particular way that water shapes stone. He would come home from a Sunday dinner at his parents' house and be quieter than usual. He would make a comment about finances that had Constance's fingerprints on it. He would say, gently, carefully, "I'm not sure Chicago is always going to be the right long-term plan. What do you think about?" And trail off in a way that was his parents' question wearing his voice. I tried to address it directly.
Twice.
Both times, the conversation became about whether I was being unfair to his family, whether I was too sensitive, whether I understood the cultural difference between my family and his, and whether I was accounting for that difference appropriately. And both times, I let it go, because I was in the middle of a surgical residency, and I did not have the bandwidth for the fight that was actually needed, which was a much larger fight than either of those conversations acknowledged. This is one of my regrets. I want to name it as a regret, because I should have insisted on that larger conversation. I should have found the bandwidth. I didn't, and the consequences of that were real, and I own them. September 2017. Third year of residency. I was 31 years old. I had by then assisted on 247 cardiac procedures. I had published 4 papers. My research on intraoperative decision-making in complex valve pathology had been cited 89 times. I had been identified by Dr. Osei and by the department chief, Dr. Amara Delgado, as someone who was on track for a fellowship at one of the top 3 cardiac surgery centers in the country. I was also, at home, increasingly absent. Not emotionally. When I was home, I was fully present. I want to be clear about that. But physically, my hours in the 3rd year of residency averaged 81 per week. I was on call every 3rd night. Some weeks I was home for dinner twice. Some weeks, once. Constance, who had been spending more time at our apartment in Wicker Park under the guise of helping James manage the household, had a particular way of noting my absences. She would leave the kitchen immaculate when I arrived home at 11 p.m., immaculate in the way that communicated it had been a disaster before she intervened. She would say, over the weekend dinners at Lake Forest that I managed to attend perhaps 1 in 3, "James, you look tired. Is everything all right at home?" The word home said to James about James, while I was sitting at the table. October 3rd, 2017. A Tuesday. James had asked me, the previous Sunday, to take a week of personal leave from the residency, to take time away from the hospital to work on things. I had explained carefully, specifically, that I could not take personal leave in October because my board certification exam was on November 3rd, which was 31 days away, and that the board exam was not optional, and the preparation was not optional, and that if he needed us to have a sustained and serious conversation about our marriage, I was committed to having it, but it needed to happen after November 3rd. He had said, "My mother thinks." I had said, "James, what do you think?" He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think we need more time together." I said, "I agree. I completely agree. 31 days. I'm asking for 31 days and then I will take leave and we will have every conversation we need to have." He said, "Okay." Monday evening, October 2nd, I came home from a 14-hour shift. The apartment was quiet. James was not there. There was a note on the kitchen counter. I will not read you the full note because it is private and it remains private. But the relevant sentence was, "I've gone to Mom and Dad's. I think we need some space. I'm sorry." I sat at the kitchen counter for about 20 minutes. I was too tired to feel the full weight of what was happening. I ate a bowl of cereal because it was the most complex meal I was capable of producing at that moment. I went to sleep. Tuesday morning.
6:15 a.m.
I was getting ready for work. My phone rang. It was Constance.
She said, "Maya,
I need you to come to the house this morning before your shift." I said, Constance, I have a 9 a.m. surgery scheduled. I can come after, she said, before your shift. This is important. I drove to Lake Forest. I arrived at 7:05. Gerald's car was in the driveway. James's car was in the driveway. A third car I didn't recognize, Catherine's, I realized later. I knocked. Constance opened the door. She looked at me with an expression that had been prepared, decided in advance. The expression of someone who has had a conversation without you and reached conclusions without you and is now presenting those conclusions as facts. She said, "Come in." I went in. Gerald was in the living room. James was in the living room. Catherine was in the living room. They were arranged in the specific geometry of people who have discussed where to sit in advance, which meant this had been planned, which meant the note on my kitchen counter had not been James's impulse, but part of something that had been constructed before he wrote it. I sat down. Constance said, "We've had a lot of conversations recently about James's well-being and the well-being of this family. And we've come to the conclusion that the current situation is not sustainable." I said, "What situation specifically?" She said, "Your marriage. The way it's structured. James is essentially living alone. He's been living alone for 3 years. You're never home. You're always at the hospital. You have," she paused, and I could see her selecting the words she'd prepared. "You have your priorities, and we respect that, but those priorities are not compatible with what James needs." I said, "James, is this what you want to say?" James looked at his hands. Gerald said, "Maya, we've arranged for your things to be packed. We'd like you to stay somewhere else while you and James take some time to assess." I said, "You've packed my things." Constance said, "We felt it was cleaner." I said, "This is my home. This is my home with James." Constance said, "James is staying here, with his family, while things are sorted out." I looked at James. He was looking at his hands. I said, "James." He said quietly, "I'm sorry, Maya. I think we need some time." And then Constance said the thing. The sentence I told you at the beginning. The one about never amounting to anything. She said it with a specific quality of finality, a closing of a door that had been decided upon before I arrived, and then she walked to the front door and opened it, and my suitcase was on the porch. I want to tell you something about the 45 seconds I stood in the rain next to that suitcase. Because people, when I've told this story before, assume that those 45 seconds were about Constance. About what she'd said. About the humiliation of having my things packed by someone else and being walked to a door. They weren't. Those 45 seconds were about James. About the hands he'd been looking at. About the fact that he'd been in that room and had said, "I'm sorry, Maya. I think we need some time." About the specific quality of that apology, which was real, he was genuinely sorry, but which was also insufficient. Because being sorry while watching something happen and doing nothing to stop it is a particular kind of sorry that does not actually stop the thing. I stood in the rain and I thought about James's hands and I thought, I cannot fix this today. I have a 9 a.m. surgery. I have 31 days until the most important exam of my career. And whatever is broken in this marriage, and something is broken, and has been for longer than this morning, it did not break this morning and it will not be repaired this morning. So, I picked up the suitcase. And I drove to the hospital. I called my colleague and closest friend at the residency, Dr. Priya Anand, from the hospital parking garage. Priya is a third-year neurosurgery resident, and she has the specific quality of being able to absorb shocking information without performing shock, which is what I needed at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. I said, "Priya, my mother-in-law just put my suitcase on her porch and told me I'll never amount to anything. I need somewhere to stay for a while." Priya said, "I have a pull-out sofa and a good coffee maker. Come tonight. Right now go to your surgery." I said I was going to. She said, "I know." I said it anyway. I did the surgery. It was a tricuspid valve repair on a 61-year-old woman named Patricia Holden who had been referred to us from a hospital in Indianapolis because her anatomy presented a specific technical challenge that her local team felt exceeded their current capabilities. Dr. Osei was scrubbed in observing. It went well. Better than well. The intraoperative findings actually allowed us to do a more comprehensive repair than the preoperative plan had accounted for, and Patricia Holden's post-operative echo 3 days later showed results that exceeded our target parameters. Dr. Osei said in the corridor after the case, "That was exceptional work." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Are you all right? You look like you've had a morning." I said, "I've had a morning. I'm all right." He looked at me for a moment with the specific look of a mentor who knows when not to push. He said, "Okay. Good work today." I changed. I drove to Priya's apartment in Lincoln Park. I slept on her pull-out sofa for 3 weeks while I found a sublet, a one-bedroom in Evanston, $1,400 a month, available November 1st, which was 2 days before my board exam. The sublet had a desk and a lamp and exactly the right quality of quiet. I studied at that desk for 31 days with an intensity that I think, in retrospect, was the grief of that October morning finding its most productive possible outlet. Because I could not fix what had happened with James. I could not undo what Constance had said on the porch. I could not go back to the living room in Lake Forest and find a version of that morning that ended differently. I could not do any of those things, but I could study. I could be completely, absolutely prepared for November 3rd. That I could do. And because it was the only thing I could fully control, I gave it everything. November 3rd, 2017. The American Board of Thoracic Surgery qualifying examination. I sat down at 8 a.m. I finished at 4:47 p.m. I walked out of the testing center on Michigan Avenue into a November afternoon, and I stood on the sidewalk and I thought, that's done. Whatever the result is, that's done. I called my mother in Hyderabad. She said, "How was it?" I said, "It was hard." She said, "Hard like impossible or hard like just hard?" I said, "Hard like just hard." She said, "Then you did fine. Now eat something." I had not told my parents about the separation. I had not told them about the porch, the suitcase, the rain, Constance's sentence. I did not tell them for another 3 weeks, because my mother would have been on the first available flight from Hyderabad and I needed to be alone with this for a while before I could receive anyone's care about it. The board results came back on December 14th, 2017. I passed. Composite score in the 94th percentile. I sent a text to Dr. Osei. I sent a text to Dr. Delgado. I called Priya. I called my parents. I did not contact James. And James did not contact me. We had spoken exactly twice between October 3rd and December 14th. Both conversations were brief, factual, and conducted with the particular politeness of two people who are being careful not to say the thing that actually needs to be said, because neither of them is ready to say it yet. The divorce process began in January 2018, initiated, technically, by James, though I think the honest accounting of who ended the marriage is more complicated than legal paperwork suggests, and I have made a certain peace with the complexity of that accounting. The divorce was finalized on June 9, 2018. It was not contentious. James and I divided what little we had to divide. We had not accumulated much, given that we'd been living largely on resident salaries for 3 years. The apartment in Wicker Park had been a rental. The Honda Civic was mine. We had a joint savings account with $14,300 in it, which we divided evenly. We had no children. James sent me an email on the day the divorce was finalized. I will read you part of it, because I think it matters for the fullness of the story. He wrote, "Maya, I'm sorry. Not for the legal process today, which I think was probably right for both of us. I'm sorry for October 3rd. I'm sorry I didn't do better that morning. I think about it more than you might expect. I hope your work is going well. I know it is. I still follow your publications. I'm proud of you, for what that's worth now. Take care of yourself." I read that email 3 times. Then I put my phone away and went to the hospital, because I had a fellowship to apply for. The Cleveland Clinic. The Mayo Clinic Cardiac Surgery Program. Stanford, Massachusetts General. I applied to all 4 in October 2018 at the end of my 4th residency year. The application process for a cardiothoracic surgery fellowship is not simple. It requires letters of recommendation from attending surgeons who have observed you directly, a personal statement or research portfolio, and in some programs, a clinical case presentation to the fellowship committee. Dr. Osei wrote my primary letter of recommendation. I know what was in it because he told me, which is unusual. Most recommenders do not tell you what they've written, but Dr. Osei sat across from me in his office in September 2018 and said, I want you to know what I'm saying about you, so that you understand what you're being asked to live up to. He said he had described me as the most technically gifted resident he had supervised in 22 years of attending practice at Northwestern Memorial. He said he had described my intraoperative decision-making as at the level of a mid-career attending. He said he had written that any program that did not accept me would be making an error they would recognize within 5 years when they saw where I ended up. I sat in his office, and I did not cry, which required some effort. I said, Dr. Osei, thank you. He said, don't thank me. It's just true. Now go write a personal statement that's worthy of the letter. I was accepted to all 4 programs. I chose Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Their minimally invasive cardiac surgery fellowship was, at the time, the most technically advanced in the country. My fellowship director would be Dr. Sandra Chin, not Dr. Sandra Hartley, different person, different field, though I have noticed over the years that the Dr. Sandras in my life have consistently been important, who was at the time performing more robotic-assisted mitral valve procedures annually than any other surgeon in New England and whose research on outcomes in complex valve pathology was the most cited body of work in the field over the preceding decade. I moved to Boston in July 2019. I had a 1-bedroom apartment in Brookline, $2,100 a month, more than I'd paid in Chicago, Boston being Boston, with a window that faced west and caught the afternoon light. I had $22,400 in my savings account, which was the most money I had ever had saved at any single point in my life. I had a 2014 Honda Accord, an upgrade from the Civic, which had finally retired at 167,000 miles, and I had 2 suitcases and a box of books, and the particular lightness of someone who has recently set down something very heavy that had been passed off as something manageable. Boston was good to me. MGH was the right choice. Dr. Chun was, in the most precise sense, exactly what a mentor should be, someone who saw what you were capable of before you were fully capable of it and constructed the conditions for that capability to emerge. She was demanding in the way that the best teachers are demanding, not arbitrarily, not as a power exercise, but because she believed that the gap between what you were doing and what you could do was the most important space in medicine, and that closing it was the work. I did 203 robotic-assisted procedures in my first fellowship year. I published 2 papers with Dr. Chun as co-author. I presented at the Society of Thoracic Surgeons annual meeting in January 2020, a presentation on robotic mitral valve outcomes in patients over 80, which generated a level of discussion in the room that Dr. Chin told me afterward was unusual for a fellow's work. I called my mother that night from my hotel room in New Orleans, where the conference was held. She said, How did it go? I said, I think it went well. She said, Did they clap? I said, They asked questions for 22 minutes after I finished. The session was supposed to end at 5. She said, That means they clapped on the inside. I laughed. It was the first full laugh I had had in a while, and it felt like something releasing. Second year of fellowship. 2020 into 2021. The pandemic changed everything about how we practiced and nothing about why we practiced, which is the most important distinction. We adapted. We kept operating. The patients who needed cardiac surgery during the pandemic needed it just as urgently as patients who needed it before, and the logistics of keeping on or running during a public health emergency are something I will not fully describe here because it would take another 40 minutes, and it deserves its own story. What I will say is that the 2 years I spent at MGH included a period of professional intensity that was unlike anything I had experienced before, and that coming out of it, I was a different surgeon than I had been going in. Not because the pandemic made me better technically, it didn't, in any direct way, but because operating in conditions of scarcity and uncertainty and elevated stakes clarified something for me about why I was doing this, about what mattered, about the specific nature of the responsibility I had chosen to carry. June 2021. Fellowship complete. I returned to Chicago. Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Attending position in the Division of Cardiothoracic Surgery. The offer had come from Dr. Delgado in April, a full attending position with protected research time, and a startup package that included $340,000 for a robotic surgery research initiative I had proposed. My salary, $487,000 per year. I was 35 years old. I was in the specific and precise accounting of the thing, done with training, and attending an actual cardiac surgeon with full operating privileges and my own service and my own patients and my own or block time. I called my parents. My father, Dr. Krishnamurti Sharma, cardiologist, the man who had looked at his daughter at age 7 playing with a stethoscope and said not how cute but she'll know how to use that properly one day, cried on the phone, openly, without the particular reserve he usually maintained. He said, "Maya, we are so proud of you." My mother said, "Now find a nice apartment with a good kitchen." I found an apartment in Lincoln Square. 2 bedrooms. $2,800 a month. A kitchen with a gas stove. East-facing windows. On the day I signed the lease, I sat on the floor of the empty living room and I thought about Constance Beaumont's porch. About the suitcase in the rain. About never going to amount to anything. About the 31 days between that morning and the board exam, and the way I had sat at a desk in a Evanston sublet and turned grief into preparation. I thought, Constance.
Look.
Not out loud. To myself. A private reckoning. And then I went to pick up the keys. I had been in attending for 7 months. It was January 2022, when Dr. Delgado called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon. She said, "I want to talk to you about a referral." I said, "Of course." She said, "Patient name is Gerald Beaumont, 68 years old. Referred from Lake Forest Cardiology Associates. Severe aortic stenosis, calcified tricuspid leaflets. The anatomy is complex. They want our opinion on surgical candidacy and approach." I did not say anything for approximately 4 seconds. She looked at me. She said, "You know this name." I said, "He's my former father-in-law." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you need to recuse?" I thought about that question. I want to be honest about what happened inside me during those seconds. Because there was a version of this moment that was about Constance's porch and the suitcase and never going to amount to anything. I won't pretend that version didn't exist.
It did.
I am a human being, not a machine, and human beings carry things. But there was another version happening simultaneously. And the other version was about Gerald Beaumont, 68 years old, with a calcified aortic valve and a complex anatomy, sitting in a cardiology office in Lake Forest and being told he needed to see a specialist. Gerald, who had sat in his living room on October 3rd, 2017, and had been part of what happened that morning, but who had also, I want to be precise here, never said never amount to anything. That was Constance. Gerald had said, "We'd like you to stay somewhere else while things are sorted out," which is a different thing. Still wrong, but different. And beyond all of that, underneath both of those versions, was the fact that Gerald Beaumont had a diseased aortic valve and a complex anatomy and needed surgery, and I was a cardiac surgeon. And my feelings about his family were not relevant to his valve. I said, "I don't need to recuse. I need to think carefully about how to handle the disclosure." Dr. Delgado looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I think that's the right answer. I want you to think about it overnight and come back to me tomorrow." I went home. I sat at my kitchen table. I thought about it overnight. The ethics of what I was considering are real, and I want to address them directly because I don't want this story to be misunderstood. Operating on a family member, even a former family member, is not straightforward. The potential for the personal relationship to compromise clinical judgment is a legitimate concern. The potential for the patient to feel coerced or unable to freely choose their surgeon given the history is a legitimate concern. These are not trivial considerations. I took them seriously. But I also knew the following things, which I wrote out at my kitchen table, and which I want to read to you, because I think the reasoning matters. First, Gerald Beaumont's aortic valve anatomy was complex. Not unusually complex for what I had been doing for the past 6 years, but complex enough that the outcome of his surgery would depend significantly on the specific expertise of the surgeon performing it. This was not a case where surgical capability was irrelevant to outcome. Second, I was one of a small number of surgeons in the region with extensive robotic-assisted minimally invasive experience, specifically in complex valve anatomy. The minimally invasive approach would, for a patient of Gerald's age and general health profile, offer significantly better recovery outcomes than the traditional open approach. Third, Gerald Beaumont had the right to know about our history and the right to choose a different surgeon if he wished. That disclosure was not optional. But the disclosure and the choice were his to make, not mine to make for him, by simply removing myself from consideration. I came back to Dr. Delgado the next morning. I said, I want to take the referral. I want to meet with Gerald Beaumont and disclose our prior relationship fully before any clinical discussion. I want to give him a clear and uncoerced opportunity to choose a different surgeon. If he chooses to proceed with me, I will operate. If he chooses otherwise, I will facilitate the best possible alternative referral. She said, I agree with that approach. I want to be present for the disclosure meeting. I said, I'd welcome that. The meeting was scheduled for January 18, 2022. Gerald Beaumont came with Constance. I had anticipated this. I had prepared for it in the specific way I prepare for difficult conversations, not scripting but clarifying. Knowing exactly what needed to be said, in what order and why. They arrived at 2 p.m. Gerald looked older than I remembered, not dramatically, but the way people look when something has reminded their body that time is not theoretical. He had the slightly labored quality that aortic stenosis gives people, a conservation of movement, a careful economy, the body managing its own resources because the pump is not working at full capacity. Constance looked exactly the same. Same bearing. Same precision of presentation. She saw me come into the conference room, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed her face that was not quite the expression she had prepared. I said, Gerald. Constance, thank you for coming. Dr. Delgado was present. I introduced her. I said, before we discuss your case clinically, Gerald, there is something I need to tell you. James and I were married from 2015 to 2018. We are divorced. You know this. What you may not have known is that I am a cardiac surgeon here at Northwestern Memorial and that your cardiologist in Lake Forest has referred you to our department. I am one of the surgeons on our team with specific expertise in the type of procedure your anatomy suggests you may need. I want you to know about our prior relationship before we discuss anything clinical. And I want you to know, without any ambiguity, that if you would prefer to work with a different surgeon, I will personally facilitate that referral with the same care I would give to any patient. This is your choice. Completely. The room was quiet. Gerald looked at me for a long time. He had the careful quality of a man who had spent 30 years in legal proceedings and knew the weight of a well-constructed sentence. He said, Maya, I know who you are. I've known who you are since James showed me your publications. A pause. He sends them to me. He has been sending them to me for 4 years. I did not know that. Gerald said, I asked to be referred here specifically. To you specifically. Another pause. He said, I owe you an apology. I've owed you one since October 2017. I should have said something that morning. I didn't. And I've thought about it many times since. Constance was looking at the table. I said, Gerald, today isn't about 2017. Today is about your heart. Can we focus on that? He said, yes. But I want you to know, before we talk about anything else. I said, I know. Thank you. And then we talked about his heart. Gerald Beaumont's aortic valve was severely stenotic. The calcification pattern was extensive and involved the subannular anatomy in a way that made a transcatheter approach, the less invasive catheter-based valve replacement that had become the standard approach for elderly patients, technically unsuitable. He needed surgery. Specifically, he needed a minimally invasive surgical aortic valve replacement, which was exactly what I did. I explained this. I showed him the imaging. I walked him through the anatomy in the specific way I do with patients who can handle the detail, and Gerald, former corporate attorney, was absolutely a patient who could handle the detail. He asked precise questions. I gave precise answers. At the end of 45 minutes, he said, if I have this surgery, what is my realistic outcome? I said, with this approach, in your general health profile, I would expect excellent valve function post-operatively. a hospital stay of 3 to 4 days instead of the 7 to 10 you'd be looking at with open surgery, and a return to normal activity within 4 to 6 weeks. The risk of the procedure, mortality, major complication, is approximately 2% in your profile. That's a realistic number, not an optimistic one, he said, and if I don't have it? I said, your cardiologist's notes indicate that without intervention, your projected clinical trajectory over the next 12 to 18 months is significant. The stenosis is severe enough that the risk of sudden cardiac event without surgery is meaningfully higher than the surgical risk. He said, so the surgery is the right choice. I said, in my clinical opinion, yes. He said, then let's do it. With you. Constance had not said a word in 45 minutes. She was looking at her husband. She was looking at the imaging on the screen.
She was looking at me.
She had the expression of someone who is in the process of revising a significant calculation and has not yet arrived at the new answer.
I said, Constance,
do you have questions? She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, something that had been held very carefully for a very long time. She said, will he be all right? I said, I'm going to do everything I know how to do. And I know a great deal. She said, I know. Said it quietly. Said it like an admission. The surgery was scheduled for February 7th, 2022. The morning of the surgery, I arrived at the OR at 6:15. My scrub tech was Dominic Okafor, who had been with me since I arrived as an attending and who had the specific quality of anticipating what I needed before I asked for it. The best scrub techs are like that. They read the procedure as it evolves, and they are already at the next step before you call for it. My perfusionist was Dr. Reena Shah, who I had worked with a dozen times and who was, in my professional estimation, the best perfusionist on our staff. I reviewed the imaging one final time at 6:45. The calcification pattern, the subannular anatomy, the approach I had planned, minimally invasive right mini-thoracotomy, robotic assistance for the valve excision, and the sewing of the new valve into position. A procedure I had done 156 times in my career. Not routine, no cardiac surgery is routine, but deeply familiar. Gerald was brought to the OR at 7:15. He was conscious. He saw me across the room, in my surgical cap and mask, and he said, good morning, Maya. I said, good morning, Gerald. How are you feeling? He said, scared. I said, that's completely appropriate. I'm going to take good care of you. He said, I know. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Paul Kim, administered induction at 7:28. Gerald went under smoothly. We positioned him. We prepped. We draped. And at 7:44 a.m., I made the first incision. I want to tell you something about what it is to operate on someone you have a history with. I have thought about how to describe this accurately, and I want to be precise rather than dramatic. The history did not disappear from my consciousness when I was in that OR. I am not wired to completely compartmentalize. What I did, what I have learned to do over years of training, was to place the history in a specific room in my mind and close the door. Not lock it. Close it. The history was there. I knew it was there, but it was not in the operating room. In the operating room, there was Gerald Beaumont's heart and my training and my team and the work. The work. At 9:17 a.m., we went on to cardiopulmonary bypass. Gerald's heart was stopped. The calcified valve was exposed. And what the imaging had shown me, the particular pattern of calcification extending into the subannular region, was exactly what I found. No surprises, which in cardiac surgery is the best possible news, because the surprises in cardiac surgery are almost never good ones. I removed the diseased valve. All of it. The decalcification was careful, more careful than usual, given the extent of involvement, because any fragment of calcium left behind is a potential source of embolic complication, and I was not going to leave anything behind. I took an extra 11 minutes on the decalcification. Dominic handed me instruments without being asked. Dr. Shah monitored the bypass circuit with the attentiveness she always brought. The new valve, a tissue valve, appropriate for Gerald's age, sized 23 millimeters, was positioned. Sutured into place. 17 sutures, placed with the particular precision that robotic assistance allows and that open surgery cannot fully replicate. At 10:43 a.m., Gerald Beaumont's heart was restarted. It came back in 2 beats. Clean sinus rhythm, immediate and steady, appearing on the monitor like a statement of fact. I watched those 2 beats, and I felt what I always feel when a heart comes back, something that is not describable in the language we normally use for professional experience. Something that is too large for that language. The heart stopped and now it beats. The person was somewhere between here and not here, and now they are here. And I was the person who made the passage possible. I closed. At 11:52 a.m., Gerald Beaumont was taken to the cardiac intensive care unit. Vital signs excellent. Echo immediately post-operative showed the new valve functioning perfectly, gradient across the valve of 8 millimeters of mercury, which was in the best quarter of outcomes for this procedure. I walked out of the OR. I removed my gloves. I stood in the scrub room for a moment. And then I went to find Constance. She was in the surgical family waiting room on the 4th floor. She was alone. She had sent her children to get coffee, I learned later, because she wanted to be alone when she heard. She was sitting very straight in a waiting room chair with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked, for the first time since I had known her, genuinely small. Not diminished. Small, in the way that people look when they are sitting with fear that they cannot manage through preparation. She looked up when I came in. I said, "He's out of surgery.
He's in the ICU.
The procedure went very well. The new valve is functioning perfectly. He's going to recover fully." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, "How long were you in there?" I said, 4 hours and 8 minutes. She said, "You were with him that whole time?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The whole time?" I said, "Yes, Constance." She looked down at her hands. She was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were full. She said, "Maya, I need to say something to you, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting, because I've been thinking about how to say it for a long time, and I'm not sure I'll get through it if you say anything." I sat down across from her. I said, "Okay." She said, "What I said to you on that porch in 2017. I have thought about those words every day since. Every day. Not with pride. With, I don't have the right word for it. Shame is the right word, but it doesn't feel large enough. I said that to you, who were in the middle of becoming what you have become. And I said it because I was frightened. Not of you. I was frightened of how much James loved you, and how little I understood your world, and how much time you spent in a place that I couldn't follow. And instead of saying any of that, instead of being honest about any of that, I said what I said. On a porch. In the rain." She stopped. She was trying very hard not to cry and not entirely succeeding. I said, "Constance."
She said, "I'm not finished." A breath.
"You have just spent 4 hours keeping my husband alive. And you didn't have to. You could have sent him to someone else. You could have said no, and I would have had no right to object. And instead you were in there for 4 hours and 8 minutes, and you saved his life. And I don't know how to," she stopped again. "I don't know what to do with that. With the distance between what I said and what you are." The room was quiet. I said, "Constance, Gerald needed surgery. I'm a cardiac surgeon. That's the whole story." She said, "That's not the whole story." I said, "It is for today." She looked at me. Her face had the open, unguarded quality of someone who has just set down something they've been carrying for a long time. The performance was gone. Whatever had been carefully arranged in her expression for 5 years was simply absent. She said, "Thank you. For him. Thank you." I said, "He's going to be fine. You can see him in about an hour." I stood up. I smoothed my white coat. I picked up my pager from the chair where I'd set it. And then I said something that I had not planned to say. Something that arrived in that moment and that I have not regretted. I said, "Constance, I know you love your son. I know that's where October 2017 came from. I'm not holding it. But I want you to know, the path that you said would never amount to anything was my father's path before me, and it was the right path for me, and I have never for one single day regretted it." She said nothing. She nodded.
Once.
A nod that was not agreement or disagreement, but acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of someone receiving a truth they cannot argue with. I left the waiting room. I walked down the corridor toward the elevators. I had a 2 p.m. consultation I needed to prepare for, a 64-year-old with a complex coronary anatomy who'd been referred from Evanston Hospital. I had notes to review and imaging to look at, and a patient who needed my full attention. I pressed the elevator button, and I thought about my father's voice on the phone in June 2021, saying, "We are so proud of you." I thought about Dr. Osei saying, "The most technically gifted resident I have supervised in 22 years." I thought about Gerald Beaumont's heart coming back in 2 beats on that monitor at 10:43 in the morning. I thought about Constance's face in the waiting room, the performance finally, fully gone. And I thought about the desk in the Evanston sublet. 31 days. The board exam. The suitcase in the rain. Every single thing that happened in the last 5 years, from the porch to the fellowship to Boston to the or that morning, had a direct, clear, unbroken line of cause and effect running through it. The porch happened. Because the porch happened, I sat at a desk in Evanston for 31 days with an intensity one might not have found otherwise. Because I sat at that desk with that intensity, I passed the board exam in the 94th percentile. Because I passed with those marks, my fellowship applications were stronger. Because my fellowship was at MGH with Dr. Chen, I became the surgeon who could do what I did for Gerald Beaumont that morning. Constance's words were not what built me. I was already being built. But her words and that morning and the rain and the 45 seconds, those things became fuel. And fuel, when you are already moving in the right direction, does not stop you. It accelerates you. The elevator arrived. I got in. Gerald was discharged on February 11th, 4 days after surgery, exactly as I had predicted. His 30-day follow-up echo was excellent. His 6-month follow-up was excellent. The last report I received from his cardiologist in Lake Forest, dated 8 months after the surgery, noted that he was clinically indistinguishable from a patient without prior valvular disease. He was hiking. He was golfing. His heart was working the way a heart is supposed to work. James sent me an email 3 weeks after the surgery. He said, "Dad told me what you did. Not just the surgery. Everything. How you handled the disclosure. What you said to Mom afterward. He told me all of it. Maya, the email went on for another paragraph that I will keep private. What I will tell you is that I read it and I wrote back, and the email I sent was honest and complete and took me 45 minutes to write. And that what came back from James was also honest and complete. And that we have, in the years since, arrived at something that is not friendship exactly, but is a genuine mutual regard. The regard of 2 people who were important to each other and did damage to each other, and have found, through time and honesty, a way to hold both of those facts simultaneously without either one canceling the other." Constance called me in March 2022. She called my office number, not my cell, which I think was deliberate, less intimate, less presumptuous. She said she was calling to thank me again for Gerald's care. She asked, carefully, whether I would be open to having coffee sometime. Not to relitigate anything. Just to, she searched for the word, talk. I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "That's fair." I did think about it. For about 2 weeks. And then I called her back and said yes. And we had coffee at a place in Lincoln Square, my neighborhood, my choice, which she accepted without comment. And it was uncomfortable, the way that conversations are when there is too much between 2 people for the conversation to hold easily. But it was also, underneath the discomfort, something real. The performance was still gone. What was left was a 71-year-old woman who had made a significant mistake and who was, in her own limited and imperfect way, trying to reckon with it. We have had coffee 3 times since then. Each time is easier than the last. I do not know what we are to each other. There is no word for the relationship between a woman and her former husband's mother when the marriage ended badly and then the woman saved the father's life, and they had coffee afterward. But it exists. It is real. And I am, I think, the better for not walking away from it. I want to tell you, as we come to the end of this, something that I think is the actual center of the story. Not the porch, not the board exam, not the or, though all of those matter and all of them are true. The actual sender is a question I have been sitting with since February 7th, 2022, since I closed Gerald Beaumont's chest and watched his heart come back in 2 beats and walked out to the scrub room and stood there in the particular silence that follows a procedure that went the way it was supposed to go. The question is, what are we doing this for?
Because I want to be honest about something.
I did not save Gerald Beaumont's life because Constance said never amount to anything, and I wanted to prove her wrong.
I want to be very clear about that.
The desire to prove people wrong is not strong enough fuel for 14 years of training. It burns too fast and too hot, and it leaves you empty at exactly the moment you need reserves. What carried me through 14 years was something different. Something quieter and more durable. It was the specific knowledge confirmed in anatomy lab at Northwestern in 2007 when I first held a cadaver heart and understood what it was, that this work, this particular, demanding, consuming, extraordinary work, was something I was meant to do. Not in a mystical sense, in a practical one. In the sense that the combination of what I was capable of and what this work required was a match that I could not walk away from, and that every year of training confirmed rather than diminished. The desire for my family's recognition was real. The hurt of Constance's words was real. The 45 seconds in the rain were real. But none of those things were the foundation. The foundation was the work. Always the work. The 4-chambered muscle and the extraordinary, terrifying, humbling privilege of being trusted with it. And here is what I want to say to you: if you are somewhere in the middle of something that the people around you do not yet have the vision to see, if you are standing on a metaphorical porch with a metaphorical suitcase in metaphorical rain, while someone tells you that you are not going to amount to anything, the people who say those words are almost always speaking from the limits of their own vision, not from any accurate assessment of yours. Constance could not see what I was becoming because she did not have the frame of reference to see it. Her world was Lake Forest and Tiffany jewelry and the specific social architecture of a family that had always known which lane it was in. She had no vocabulary for a woman who stopped hearts for a living and started them again. Her failure to see me was not evidence of my invisibility. It was evidence of her limited sight. But here is the more important thing. Here is the thing I had to learn, and that took longer to learn than any surgical technique I have ever acquired. Her limited sight was not my problem to solve. It was not my job to teach Constance Beaumont to see. My job was to keep building. My job was the desk in Evanston,
The board exam.
the fellowship, the 203 robotic procedures at MGH. My job was to be in that or on February 7th, 2022, with quiet hands and everything I knew, giving Gerald Beaumont's heart back to him. That was my job. And I did it. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. I walked out. I turned left toward my office. I had a 2 p.m. consultation and notes to review and a patient who needed me. I sat down at my desk. I opened the file. I got to work.